Hello and welcome to the Stagwell Group's webinar on research you can believe in, getting polling right in the future. My name is Sara. I'm Axios' executive editor, and I'm thrilled to be moderating a conversation with you today, as well as with Mark Penn, managing partner of the Stagwell Group, and Will Kinzel, vice president of government relations at Molson Coors. Welcome, gentlemen. It's nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's dig right in and talk about polling. There's a lot of conversation. A lot has been written about what the pollsters got right, what they got wrong in the 2020 election. Mark, you wrote something yourself about this in the Wall Street Journal recently. And there was a lot of talk about the demise of the polling industry. I'm sure as someone who does work, you have quite some particular thoughts about this. What do you think the polls got right? What are the lessons we need to take away from what needs to be improved next time around?
Well, first, let me suggest that Stagwell's Harris poll, which got 4-point difference for Biden as its final poll, was almost exactly correct. And so not all polls are the same. And I think that the Harris poll, they've managed to get the weighting and the structure of the country right. I think there were a lot of polls that really had 8-point races. I know we had one, but we had a closing at the end that had 12-point races. Some of the most famous polls had it as high as 12 points. I don't think they really thought through the ramifications of what a 12-point win would actually have looked like. A 12-point win would have had 40 states going in Biden's direction, and that was never happening if you looked at the individual state-by-state configurations. An 8-point race, I think people didn't think through, well, an 8-point race would probably have kept Congress about the same because it was a 7-point race in the midterms. And I don't think people realized that if it was a 4-point race, that actually that the number of Democratic seats would shrink. So what do I think people do a good job at and a bad job at? I think we did a good job getting what the country looks like more or less right. I think it's important that a lot of the other polls adjust themselves 4 or 5 or 6 points to the more moderate and conservative country that it actually is, based on the voting habits and the patterns as reflected in a really high turnout election. And then I think second, the level of analysis behind the polls and what the implications are to the Electoral College, to the overall kind of popular and other vote, understanding the subcomponents of the vote. That level of analysis, frankly, seems relatively weak compared to what it could be. I think polls are more right than the analysis of polls really is.
Right. And I mean, one point I think a lot of people make is even if we got the polls this year got it right with calling the presidential race correctly in terms of the electoral vote and the popular vote. I mean, I think there's a lot of concern, though, about just representation of conservatives and Trump voters. There was a lot of worry ahead of the election about missing the quote unquote shy Trump voter. But I think that like overall, I'm curious about your take, but my reading of it is that we have a problem with some polls missing just overall Trump voters, shy or not. What is your take on that, Mark?
Well, I'll just say that I think some of the polls, when you look at the country, it's 24% liberal, 38% moderate, 38% conservative. I think some number of the polls need a 5-point adjustment. But there also were these races, like in Maine, maybe South Carolina, and other states, Michigan, where the polls were just way off, 10, 15, 20 points off. And that to me suggests that these environments in which there's $100, $200, $300 million spent, enormous kind of media narrative, that people may just stop being honest to polls in those circumstances. I had a poll we did for one of the meetings, and I didn't believe it. I didn't even release it because I've seen this effect before. I saw it in New Hampshire in 2008 after Obama won in Iowa. No one said they were voting for Hillary in New Hampshire, but you won because sometimes there's a media narrative and 100 that they just assume whoever's calling is not from an honest poll, but from one of the campaigns, and they stop being honest, just as they were not honest in the Soviet Union and other places. So I do think you have to understand that sometimes there are just situations here that become unpollable.
And Will, let me bring you into this conversation because from where you sit, I'm interested in your take about trust in polls, trust in surveys for the private sector. You rely on this to kind of get some tea leaves into the pulse of the nation. What's your take? Do you have any concerns out of what you saw in the polls versus the results?
Thanks, Sarah. I guess I'd be curious on Mark's thoughts on this, but it occurs to me that there's also a good number of polls, just like there's a good number of press releases or stories that appear on the web that are more designed to elicit a certain result. It's a poll that's designed to elicit more fundraising. It's a poll that's designed to convince people of a circumstance rather than inform people about a circumstance. And yeah, I don't know that there's a good answer to how you assign credibility to one and assign a different narrative to the other. But I think there seems to me a lot of that goes on right now. And for the general public looking at polls, it's incredibly difficult to figure out what is an accurate poll. I think, similar to the Harris poll that's got a consistent record and comes out with a consistent, routine analysis of what's out there and what's just out there designed to try and make Sara think something is going on to then get Sara to take a specific action. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. Mark, what do you think? I mean, you have done some analysis looking at kind of the ideological breakdown, and we are coming off an election that was preceded by a lot of unrest in the streets, a lot of people outraged about racial injustice, and everyone was worried about how that kind of movement would factor into politics as well as into messaging that corporations got into, frankly, right? So when you think about something like Black Lives Matter, a lot of companies came out with statements about that. How do you, Will, I'm interested in your thoughts, like how do you think about a movement like that, how to understand it, and how to position your messaging to, be mindful of the moment?
I think there's a burden to be mindful of those moments as they're coming along, but it's also making sure from a messaging standpoint that that whatever you're conveying as an entity is authentic to whatever that moment may be, right? And that it's we've had lots of conversations about this, and the most important thing from our perspective in any kind of messaging coming out is that authenticity, right? And that authenticity is what drives a certain level of consumer confidence, both in the brand itself, but I think that's also reflected back when we ask consumers about the brand, are we going to get an honest response? And the more authentic we can be to the consumer, the more honest the response is going to be back to us. And it allows, I think from a corporate standpoint, one to have a little more, perhaps more confidence in that type of polling and that type of question than you get in the political environment, where as Mark was just describing, based on whatever the media narrative may be, you run into circumstances where the people that are being polled just aren't willing to share or aren't willing to be accurate about what they're thinking.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested what you think too, Mark. I mean, it seems to me that so many companies are going further and further into political statements or statements that speak to activism. This is one example. I don't know if you guys saw this, but I was struck by before the election, I was looking at my Patagonia catalog that came to my home, and they're certainly very progressive and don't shy away from their messaging, which is part of their brand. But in the back of the catalog, it had they were naming names of people senators that they wanted voted out. And I was like, wow, I've never seen something like this before. So specific. I wonder what you think about that, Mark, and that trend.
Well, I think if you think that commercial business is hard, imagine now you're in the commercial business and suddenly you get in the middle of politics, right? And so now you have the cross currents of politics and of your commercial business. I always give companies a caution flag. Look, some companies, and I think Patagonia may take a deliberately progressive stance, and that's part of their brand identification. But a lot of other companies are saying, are kind of wondering exactly how do they fit in. And then I say, well, first, have to be very careful when somebody comes to you with a poll question. Do you think your company should do more social good? Who is going to answer no to that question? Right. So you're going to be some poll finding like that and saying, oh, we should do more social good. Now, we always ask the question in the Harris poll, do you think the company should be more involved in issues, or should they spend more time explaining the benefits of their product? When I put it that way, it comes out explaining more of the benefits of their products, right? And then you take a typical issue, and it's highly complex. So if you look, for example, Black Lives Matter, we've been polling Black Lives Matter really as a phrase / organization for a while, and it was at 55%, quite positive. Then it was at 51, 48, 45. So public opinion, political opinion changes. The police were at 60%, 68%, 70%. So then to take a look at polls, a lot of polls might have something about Black Lives Matter, but then they didn't poll about the police. And when you ask about, is there a lot of racism within the police? No, 70% say, yeah, there's a lot of racism. But when you say, do you want to defund the police? 72% say, no, I don't want to defund the police. So it's really a complex picture, right? I think there's a lot of racism. Half the people had sympathy for the Black Lives Matter movement, other half didn't. The police have a tremendously positive image, more so than you would think, not in the minority community, but outside that community. Defunding the police was a more or less toxic idea. Reforming the police, right, and making it better was not, right? And so for someone now to kind of launch in the middle of what's obviously a highly contentious issue without understanding all of the different sides of the issue, what public opinion really is, and how they should weigh in, I think they too often get a one-sided view of what's happening and don't get the total picture. And that is my most important message about understanding an America that does have, that does come out almost 50-50 in the presidential race. You have to understand both sides of that 50-50 coin when you decide to wade into issues or politics. And I think Will would agree with me on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of one of the big trapdoors that's out there for brands that cascade across all ideologies, right? And I think Mark may be dead on in terms of the an entity like Patagonia. I think you could go back 20 years and you would see veins of sustainable approaches in a Patagonia catalog that have existed. That's been part of their core brand for a long time. So maybe that back page that you saw isn't that far of a departure from what they view themselves, how they view themselves, and how they view their customer base. When you've got a customer base that spans all ideologies, reacting too quickly to something that's on social media, or something that may be in a flash poll somehow, or just a media narrative for a couple of days, you run huge risk that there may be a far larger part of your customer base that takes a different opinion. And if they don't take a different opinion, perhaps they take the opinion that you as a company, as a consumer products company, shouldn't have an opinion.
Right.
And let me just jump in. Let me just jump in and add that, in a follow-up poll, we ask people, do you think corporations, when they take these stands, are being sincere, or are they just trying to gain points with other elites, or essentially virtue signaling? Most people say, it's not sincere. So I think Will is pointing out that there is also a high bar for someone who's coming into this all of a sudden to really whether or not they will resonate as more phony when they're trying to be more authentic.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. And I'm interested to know, Mark, if you guys have more polling about this, as you explained, if we could just stay on this topic for a little bit. Like, it is complex. Here we are a month away, and President-elect Joe Biden has mentioned systemic racism as a priority, right? And this is, to me, like a challenge for messaging and how corporations, if they choose to make a statement, either in terms of their own organizations and how they will lead, or how they will be more representative, or what their values are on certain issues like representation in their workplace or policies at their workforce. These are big topics that he's going to have to navigate as president. I'm curious, Mark, as someone who's advised presidents, what do you think about that?
Well, look, I think we haven't seen yet what Joe Biden wants to accomplish or can practically accomplish, and how he's going to scope that out, since we don't know the result in the Georgia Senate races. But I think that he's indicated more than anything else a strong preference for doing a lot more about climate change. So political issues change pretty dramatically now between Democrats and Republicans. Or, as I say right now, we're one country divided by two parties, in the sense that I think most issues the public would like to see. Oh, let's have immigration reform.
Teams video.
Let's have immigration reform, and let's tighten up our borders. But let's also do something for DACA and maybe have a path to citizenship. So they tend to actually want to do some of everything. Same thing on the police. Let's eliminate racism. Let's have police reform, but let's have more police and less crime, right? And what's happening in the body politic here that makes it doubly hard for companies is the Republicans or Trump will talk about, cracking down on immigration and supporting the police, and then they'll hear exactly the opposite when what they really want is a blend of everything. And that, I think, is what makes winding through this more difficult. And when I worked with Clinton, we wound up accepting a blend of things, and that's why we had balanced budget and welfare reform and all these other kind of accomplishments that really got what we wanted to move and gave the other side some of what they wanted to move. And the question is whether Joe Biden is going to return to that kind of philosophy in governing after we've seen two administrations basically only get through what they really could get through by when their own party controlled both chambers or not.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, Mark. Thanks for your perspective on that. And I'm interested, Will, just for you from the kind of corporate perspective, when you do see our nation, even if Mark makes a good case, there's a center here, you do hear very loud voices on the extreme right and the extreme left. And it sounds like your point of view is stay out of it. But I want to make sure that I'm getting that right, or to retreat and kind of not engage on the political messaging. But I do feel like that is challenging when you have, speaking as someone who runs a news organization, so difficult when you have so many people, I think, fragmenting even more. I won't be surprised to see that you see social media fragmenting, Parler. We already had cable news fragmentation. So how do you message in the middle of that increasingly noisy space and divided space, like everyone in their own bubble?
Well, and I think, Sarah, my response, just to take a step back, I don't think my answer to that is sort of retreat or don't engage as much as it is listen but listen carefully, and not to be too hokey, I suppose. But my father-in-law used to have a phrase that you've got two ears and one mouth and you should use them proportionally. And I think that in some respects that phrase really holds true right now. It's not that you don't listen, that the corporate community shouldn't listen and pay attention to what's going on in the country and be conscious of that. The question is, what's the best response? I think there's a great conversation. I know it's a great conversation that's occurring within Molson Coors, certainly, and a great conversation that's encouraging, I think, within a lot of corporate environments across the country about race, about diversity, about the importance of a wide range of thought and what and how powerful and important that can be for a company in making sure that you have all ideas on the table and that the best ideas come forward. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a press release needs to be issued the next morning. Right? That's more of a process change for a company and transformational change for corporate America to go through, as opposed to trying to be mentioned in the news or then because as often as I think people are asking you to be mentioned in the news, it's because they want to make news out of you.
Mm-hmm. So can I put you on the spot, Will? Can you give me an example of a conversation you guys have had around that, around listen and deciding whether to engage, and what did you decide to do?
I mean, I think there's been look, no question with the Black Lives Matter movement going on. I think there have been, first of all, there have been conversations within the company that are wide open, from the CEO on down, to say, internal conversations for the company to have, to say, for people to share what's on their minds and make sure that that every employee feels like they're being heard. And those conversations continue. I think the focus on diversity and inclusion is an important aspect of what we're doing now, and but it's not I think the important recognition is that that's not a one-time thing. That's an ongoing process that needs to then be woven into a corporate culture moving forward, if you want that to truly make an impact.
Mm-hmm. Mark, do you have any examples from some of your clients? You don't have to name names, but I'm just kind of interested in the kinds of conversations that you've had.
Yes, unfortunately, doing it without naming names is really hard.
You invited a journalist to moderate this
from
panel,
to the widget industry. I think that the best advice I can say about this, because I've seen some clients do a really effective job of getting in issues, and some clients make a multi-billion-dollar mistake in terms of getting involved, is be sure to consult political professionals before you get into this. Because what I really see is that sometimes people will just kind of take direction from maybe a team that's in Hollywood, and they won't really realize that they have to consult, more broadly, to understand what the impact of what they're doing, would or could be. And so I really think the potential possibility here for fracturing your consumer base is really quite high. In general, though, I do think that we're in a very unusual time for the last 4 years, where President Trump dominated and created constant conflicting news cycles, at which putting a point on issues and drawing a conflict or contrast was his message of the day that dominated. And now we have someone who's not going to be doing that, right? Who's affirmatively pulling back from press and press interviews and almost any communication, frankly, as of now. But even assuming they get into a more regular cadence, you're not going to have that kind of energy and conflict, I think, on a daily basis. And so I think companies can bring it down a little bit, look to be, I think, more unifying in nature, given kind of America chose to have a different tone. And I think choosing tone was a critical part of the presidential race, in the sense that on issues, Trump did have a pretty significant advantage, but on that kind of, both the character, but even the underlying conflict, he lost that significantly.
Yeah, right. It's almost like Biden has really promised to have a boring presidency, but maybe that's just my news perspective.
Well, the unexpected always happens when you're president.
Yeah, right. Let's go back to polling just for a moment, because there is, I think some kind of a little more nerdy questions when you get into the weeds about some of the issues in polling in terms of just getting people to participate. How concerned are you, Mark, that Democrats in particular just tend to participate more often, be willing to listen and participate in a poll, answer questions for 20 minutes at home, and therefore, that draws into question some of the true perspective that we're getting from this. And there's been a lot of talk in the polling industry about, like, do you text someone and ask them questions? Do you do the traditional phone calls? Do you call cell phones? Or what portion do you do online polling or panels? And I'm just curious to know, like, how do you think that the industry can really address this kind of credibility question?
Well, I used to give a talk at Microsoft called Data, Not Anecdotes, to visiting executives. And so I would start off the discussion with, okay, between relying on what you see your spouse or partner and children doing and relying on your market research department, which do you would rely on more? And 2/3 would always say the first, their family. So
Right.
I would try to encourage them to really get a better understanding of how data and statistics really can influence the decisions that they're going to make, especially in a world where you have to get the right ad to the right person at the right time. And what we're really building here is a set of companies that's dedicated towards bringing together the marriage of creativity with kind of the underlying data science. So I do think we have to shore up, the credibility of that, because as more and more media is fundamentally addressable, more and more products that aren't universally used but are used by segments of the population can only effectively be marketed through a data-based marketing understanding of that. So now if I step back to getting the right technology behind that, obviously now that's a combination of third-party data, first-party data, and survey data, right? And I think survey data in most situations is accurate if people spend a lot of time on what their actual sampling frame is. I mean, I remember at a company I worked for, they said to me, oh no, don't worry, we replaced everything now. We get all this great in-house data from an operation we've set up in India, okay? 2 years later, they realized that they got plenty of data at a lower cost, but it was all junk, right? And so careful, systematic, data collection through regular repeated processes on a consistent basis, right, cannot be overrated in importance. All data is not created the same. I think that online polling is the state of the art in my perspective. Just as when I started out in polling, we moved from door to door to phone. I think people are more willing to actually give a significant amount of time and answer detailed questions. I think you just have to watch out, as I said before, about these areas where there's so much conflict and so much in the air that perhaps people don't have basic freedom. I mean, I asked a series of questions. Do you think that liberal speech is being censored? 40% said that. I said, do you think conservative speech is being censored? 60% said that. Well, the important thing is everybody said that speech was being censored, and the higher those numbers are, the more difficult it will be to get information from people by asking them, as opposed to just looking at their behavior and having to make do with what their behavior is. We've also designed something at Stagwell called Telefia, which after people have completed a response, they can download Telefia, and Telefia will then match their behavior to what their attitude says. So if they said, like, I'm a liberal voting for Joe Biden, whose number one issue is climate change, and then all they did was watch, Tucker Carlson videos afterward on their phone, clearly there's a bit of a disconnect here. And so we've created a technological device for, I think, looking into that disconnect. And also, look, there's a lot of intent that people have that they don't follow through. I think this whole thing about mail voting versus in-person voting has just a lot to do with the fact that it was harder to vote by mail, and a lot of people who said they would vote in person and were discouraged from voting by mail just weren't free those couple hours, couldn't get off, or it was kind of cold, or it was inconvenient. And so sometimes people don't follow through with their intent, and it's important for us to understand that.
Right. It sounds like you guys have adjusted kind of your ways of capturing data. I always love the anecdote about people who say they read The Economist versus who actually do, for example, or The New Yorker. Pick your magazine of choice, or any magazine for that matter. Well, great. It's been great to talk with you. Will, do you have any other final thoughts, takeaways you wanted to share before we wrap up?
I think one of the things that makes sense from our perspective is to building on the concept of authenticity is just to make sure that you take things local as well. I think, a big national statement may play in sort of what, or may allow for you to be used as a example from one side or the other. But the most important thing we can do if we're going to be authentic about, let's say, sustainability and water is working with in local markets and local communities to either restore waterways. I mean, water is one of the sort of prime ingredient when it comes to beer and all of our products, right? So good water makes good beer, and that's so restoring those waterways is important, and that's a way that we can be authentic about sustainability, about having goals that and conveying an image rather than, I think what Mark was alluding to earlier, sort of companies that agree with XYZ international accord. Well, that's not really relevant to that company's core business. And the more relevant you can be to your core business and be authentic, and then and again to then put out a message that resonates with different sectors of the economy is important.
Right. Well, thanks so much to both of you for this conversation. It's been great to hear your perspectives and really just get together. And because we can't do this in person, and I hope it's valuable for all those watching. Thanks again for joining me. And I think that's it. That's a wrap. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.